this. All right, wonderful. Well, thank you so much, and welcome to everyone joining us on this South Carolina History Newsletter podcast number 2. My name's Kate Fowler, and today I'm so honored to be interviewing Trish Smith and Luke Pecoraro. Luke, did I pronounce your last name correctly? I hope I did.
You did. Thank you.
Okay, great. Both of whom do very important work at Drayton Hall, which is a U.S. National Historic Landmark and an 18th century plantation house and property located on the Ashley River, 15 miles northwest of Charleston. And I love this from the website, from the Drayton Hall website. It says, for more than 250 years, Drayton Hall has stood witness to the American South. Among the best and most complete examples of Southern colonial life open to the public today, the property holds a vital educational responsibility. It is also an active archaeological site with an extensive museum collection of rare 18th and 19th century objects and artifacts. And with that, now let me introduce my distinguished guests. Trish Smith is the Director of Preservation Archives at Drayton Hall and has been with the site since 2010. Her major areas of focus are architectural research and conservation, collections care, exhibit design and fabrication, and disaster preparedness and recovery for museums and heritage sites. She has a Master's of Science in Historic Preservation from Clemson University and the College of Charleston, was a Wood Fellow at Drayton Hall and an NEH Fellow at the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation's Digital History Center. In 2017, Trish traveled to Northern Italy as a Decorative Arts Trust Emerging Scholar, recognized for her research on Palladian architecture. I love this. Outside of work, Trish and her husband are raising 2 daughters, and in her stolen moments, she loves to read and hear what everyone else is reading. I love that. Welcome to the show, Trish.
Thank you.
And Luke Pecoraro is the Director of Archaeology and Collections for the Drayton Hall Preservation Trust. He has worked as a field archaeologist in the Mid-Atlantic, the Chesapeake, New England, and the Caribbean on a variety of prehistoric and historic sites, previously serving as the Director of Curatorial Services for the Jamestown-Yorktown Foundation, as well as the Director of Archaeology for George Washington's Mount Vernon. Yay! Luke is also a research archaeologist for the First Colony Foundation, searching for the 16th century lost colony on Roanoke Island. He holds a bachelor's degree in history, Virginia Commonwealth University, a master's and PhD in archaeology from Boston University. He is an active member of several professional organizations, including the Society for Historical Archaeology, Post-Medieval Archaeology, and the Society of Early Americanists. He was also named the National Trust for Historic Preservation's 40 Under 40 People Saving Places in 2019, and was the recipient of an international Center for Jefferson Studies at Monticello Residential Fellowship in 2022. You both are so impressive and so fantastic. To you both, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Yay. So like I said, I've been, kind of before our interview today, I was describing to Luke and Trish how I've had a personal fascination with Drayton Hall for many months now. And as I've dove into the newsletter, I convinced my husband for our wedding anniversary in May to take me to Drayton Hall. We had the most magical tour of the property, learning so much from the guide, so much about the architecture, the preservation efforts, and seeing that it was an active archaeological site was also extremely interesting. And then taking the tour around the grounds as well. So it's very special to me that I'm getting to interview you both and to hear more about the work you're doing to preserve this incredibly important site for American history and for South Carolina history. So I thought I'd start by asking you both to kind of introduce yourselves and tell us a little bit about your role at Drayton Hall, and how it's kind of evolved over time.
You want me to go first?
Yeah,
Luke?
yes, you go first, Trish.
Yeah, you've been here longer.
Okay.
Yeah. So I like to say that I've been at Drayton Hall for 14 years on the payroll. I came here while I was in graduate school, and I thought that I was going to be doing Portuguese paleography. I had to do like 10 hours of volunteer time for a historic site in Charleston, and I was the last one to pick, basically. And what a fateful start of events that was. I don't speak Portuguese. I was willing to take a crack at deciphering some, ye old handwriting or something. And,
ye old handwriting.
Yeah, and hand that over to someone who could then translate it. Happily for me and probably everyone else, I ended up scrubbing artifacts instead, which I was much better suited to do.
Mm-hmm.
And I did that for a while and kind of fell in love with the place and kept finding reasons to come back. And um, so my first real role here was a Wood Family Fellowship, where I worked on creating a preservation archive for the site. And it was a time when they were just building a preservation department.
Mhm.
And I had some skills that I felt like Drayton Hall could use, and made the case that I could do the hands-on work to actually preserve the historic buildings here. And so that's what I started doing as a preservation technician. I worked on the house, I cleaned the house. It was a lot of
Yes.
hot and dirty work, but very rewarding, and I think made me appreciate this place so much more. And so over the years, I've managed to do less and less of the really dirty and hot
I see
parts
you
of
have
the
an
house.
associate. You have an associate now, I see.
I do. I have an associate who gets to do a lot of that work now. But sometimes it's nice to get back out there and get my hands dirty and like remember how I started here. But now it's a lot more project management and like handling the really big high level preservation projects here, which is very fun too.
Fantastic. And
Yeah.
Luke, tell us about your role.
Yeah, well, the long, strange trip and progression southwards from New England to the Mid-Atlantic to Charleston, has been all driven by archaeology. And I have to give a shout out to our current CEO, Carter Hudgens. He and I both cut our teeth in the trenches at Jamestown,
Hmm.
working in our late teens and early 20s to uncover the remains of James Fort. So the opportunity to work under a CEO who understands the importance of archaeological fieldwork and what it brings to site interpretation and how it can draw visitors into a
Hmm.
site was something that was important for me. And certainly, I've gotten a lot of opportunities to work on some high profile sites, but the big appeal for me to make the move from working more in the museum and curatorial world at the museums of the Jamestown Yorktown Foundation to come here in 2021 was
Hmm.
that Drayton Hall has had a presence of archaeology since it was acquired by the National Trust for Historic Preservation in 1974, but that wasn't always a permanent department. And the
Mm.
opportunity arose to create a permanent department in 2021, which was what piqued my interest to come on down and
Sure.
work at Drayton Hall, where we have human occupation on the site dating back to the 13th century with Native American settlements. You've got a
Wow.
very early European period of occupation beginning as early as 1673 with the Carolina proprietorship, and then you have the
Yes.
Drayton family's occupation. And
Hmm.
it's an incredibly rich resource, and the scratch of the surface has really only been touched from an archaeological perspective. And even in the limited campaigns of fieldwork that have been done since the 1970s, we have over 1 million artifacts in our collection, and we're continuing to add to that on a daily basis when we're out in the field. And we haven't even gotten into the hinterlands of the plantation, so to speak. We've really focused mostly around the main house lot, but the stories that you have the ability to tell about the people who lived and worked at Drayton Hall, passed through, and everything else from the material leavings is quite vast. And
Hmm.
I feel like there is lifetimes of work to be done here. So it's a very exciting prospect. And as you've already hinted on, the history of South Carolina is very diverse indeed.
Hmm.
And there's a lot of appeal for me in trying to delve into all these different human stories that we can get into just on one archaeological site.
Absolutely. And I felt that energy when we visited in May. I felt like y'all had just this was such a rich historical site where, I mean, literally in front of my eyes, somebody was working on one of the what do you call them? The side buildings? Is there a better
The
term for
flanker.
it? The
Yeah,
what?
there's the flanker buildings, north
The
and south
flanker
flanker.
buildings. Yes. And we actually got to speak with your intern at the visitor center who was
Mhm.
polishing, she was cleaning bits of gorgeous pottery. And I thought, oh my gosh, this is happening right before our eyes in real time. I could feel that energy and I want to congratulate you all and continue to cheer y'all on because I can tell what important work this is. And um, I could really feel it. So I love that. I love your description of how your work there has evolved. Um, and for our readers, I know I gave the description at the top of what Drayton Hall is, but did one of you or both of you kind of give a brief, I know this is a hard question, give like a little brief overview of Drayton Hall and kind of its historical significance to South Carolina, and kind of do like a little brief introduction for us, if you would.
Sure. Well, I think we can both add to this, but I'm going to punt to Trish on this one as our South Carolina native to speak more succinctly about what Drayton Hall means to South Carolina, and then I'll add my bits as the newcomer.
All right.
Take it away,
Thanks.
Trish.
Well, I think it was helpful for Luke to tee that up as, a South Carolina native and how we understand the significance of Drayton Hall, because I actually grew up in Columbia, in the, capital city for South Carolina, and we had several buildings there named for prominent Drayton family members. And so you'll see that throughout the state that they were very involved politically, not just in South Carolina, but really in the formation of this country. And Luke is probably better equipped to talk to us about that part. But beyond South Carolina, Drayton Hall itself, the main house, is very important architecturally. And this is something that we interpret a lot here, is that it is a Palladian building, and it is widely recognized as the first example of this Palladian style of architecture in North America. And it's so ubiquitous now. We see it everywhere at schools and bank buildings and
Banks, yeah.
government buildings, places that are really projecting these ideas of authority and power that really touched down first here at Drayton Hall. And we think it's no accident that a man who was making his wealth by enslaving others chose a style of architecture that was made to communicate these ideas. So this is a really big, important idea, not just for South Carolina, but for the whole country and really across the world where we're using this kind of architecture still. It's important for people to understand what that means when we make that kind of choice with this building.
You just gave me chills. That's an incredible thing to think about, that this was the first time Palladian architecture had been used in the New World. And literally every day you see it in these buildings that are meant to communicate power in our lives. And thank you so much for that. I hadn't really put those pieces together in my head. But yes, Luke, I'd love to hear your perspective as well.
Well, I think Trish teed it up excellently too, and I think we'll probably be saying that to each other back and forth, which is why this is such a fun environment to work in. But that idea of the authoritarian architecture and the fact that this is a plantation landscape is very important to recognize in the American historical legacy, and revolves around events that we're still grappling with today. It's also the site of early European and Native contact. It's a site where Native Americans were enslaved. Not a lot of people think about the Native American slave trade in South Carolina, but it certainly happened. And it's something that we're able to uncover through archaeological excavations and through the documents. And as we are on the run up to deciding how we're going to commemorate America 250 years in 2026, we're in a really interesting place because Drayton Hall is not necessarily the home of one of the founders, right? We think of all these big historic house museums throughout the Mid-Atlantic that all relate to people, and they survive because they're from the founding era. John Drayton is certainly on the periphery. Charles Drayton and then William Henry Drayton, John Drayton's other son, were involved in the Patriot cause, but they weren't really into the thick of it, so to speak. But the site has an awful lot to still offer when it comes to American Revolutionary War history. This is likely the spot where the British Army successfully crossed over the Ashley River to besiege the city of Charleston and take it in 1780. And then after Yorktown is over, Drayton Hall becomes the headquarters for American General Anthony Wayne, who is also often given the nickname Mad Anthony Wayne. And this becomes his headquarters until the end of the war in 1783, when British resistance is mopped up. So we have a lot of people that are bound up in the revolution from the military side, but then what exactly happens to the enslaved population while all of this is happening and going down? What choices are they making? We have an awful lot of stories to tell and be able to delve into at this one plantation site. And I think that that is what makes it very significant, in terms of what other resources we have in South Carolina and arguably the rest of the 13 colonies.
Absolutely. And I remember during the kind of the pre-tour in the visitor center, there's this huge, enormous timeline of the Drayton family, its legacy, its existence on the property, which I thought was so well done, as well as an emphasis on the Drayton, was it William Henry Drayton, on the diary that was kept of the daily life on the property. Which Drayton was that again?
That
It's
was
Charles Drake.
Charles.
Charles
Yes.
Drayton, and how I really want to commend the tour guide. Unfortunately, I can't remember his name, but for one of the first times ever in visiting a plantation, he was able to use the names of the enslaved people who worked there in the tour. So when we went down to the kitchen, he was able to say that there was a woman named Dumplin, and I raised my hand and said, I'm sorry, was that Dumpling? And he says, Dumplin with an apostrophe. We know from the diary that her name is Dumplin. And was it Mary? I can't remember the other name.
Yes.
Um, wow. Okay. Mary and Dumplin, who cooked the food down here. And it just brought this to a level I have never felt before at a site like this, where I completely agree, and you guys must feel it so much too, that we're reaching a point in our country's history where I feel like plantations over the past decade have kind of been, people have kind of been, ooh, this history is very difficult. We kind of don't want to touch this right now. Now it feels like we're entering into a place where, oh my goodness, we actually want to lean into this history. We want to delve into the history of the enslaved people and name them and be able to talk about them. And it just gave me chills on the tour, and it was a wonderful thing. So I love that y'all are exposing these stories. And um, actually, I have a question for Luke on that. During the tour, I raised my hand because I've recently read the book Sleeping with the Ancestors by Joseph McGill Jr. And I asked if there were efforts being made to kind of expose the not expose but highlight the slave dwellings on the property. And he said that your department was working on that. And then I saw um, an excerpt in the Drayton Hall magazine about this. Would you be able to talk about that a little bit? Because that is so exciting.
Sure. Yeah, it's a very ambitious work plan that we have set out for our very small team of two. But we augment our staff with volunteers and coming out of the post-pandemic world, so to speak, with residential colleges and universities getting back into classroom instruction. I'm very hopeful that we're able to be able to train the next generation of folks who are coming through programs that the College of Charleston is offering. And
Wow.
the Clemson University Masters in Historic Preservation program, both of which are local. And the piece that you reference in the Drayton Hall magazine, that was actually a Wood Family Fellowship that was done by one of the students in the Clemson program, looking at lines of sight based on aerial
Yes.
imagery that we had taken at Drayton Hall to be able to kind of strip away the tree canopy so you could
Right.
see the plantation landscape as it would have existed when it was under cultivation. And that involves, an early rice landscape. There's references to experiments with indigo going on the plantation.
Wow.
But I think cotton was really king as it became developed by Charles Drayton's tenure of ownership. So all of that landscape that you see on the west side of the house on the approach would have been cleared and open. So talking about authority and ideas
Mm.
of panopticon and the big house being able to see just about everything,
Right.
is really an important concept that we use when we're trying to go out into the thick woods to locate the residences for the enslaved population. So it's going to take a little bit of time for us to get into that. We have oblique references to a slave barracks being constructed in 1804 from Charles Drayton.
Hmm.
Um, but it's a challenge because we also have from oral history that same slave barracks after the Civil War ends and the landscape turns to the mining of phosphate rock on the
Mm.
property, that barracks is used to house convicts as well.
Oh my
So you're getting
gosh.
into a really interesting potential signature for archaeology, a slave barracks to a prison, but still housing the same people, because
Yeah.
even though the slaves are emancipated, they go to
Yes.
work in the phosphate mines, and then you have institutional um, kind of slavery taking place during that period. So
Oh my
for the
goodness.
meantime, while we get the program jump started, we're focusing on finishing some of the work that was done in the 70s and 80s on
Hmm.
those enslaved spaces, because the flanker buildings both would have been enslaved spaces, as would the main house have been. So we're
Gotcha.
developing a strategy to look for all of that.
That's amazing. Thank you. And Trish, another thing that really was exciting for me to hear in the tour was um, that the Drayton family relative, I'm sorry, I'm forgetting her name at the moment, that in her will, from a historic preservation point of view, she wanted the house to remain exactly as it was. She wanted it to be, you know, made safe, but I love this idea that she didn't want it altered in any way. And can you speak to the importance of that? And is this a rare thing in historic preservation? And how have you kind of taken those wishes of the Drayton family and kind of run with it while keeping the property strong?
The woman that you heard about on the tour is Charlotta Drayton,
Right.
and she passed away in 1969, and it was her express wish that the house be preserved as is, as much as possible. And in 1974, when the National Trust purchased the house from the Drayton family, they understood that, but they also recognized that Drayton Hall came to them in an incredibly rare condition. It
Mm.
is really untouched. There's so much original material from the 18th century, and that's just very rare for that to happen. Oftentimes, when houses change hands, we can probably relate to this today. You move into a new house, you want to make it your own, you might renovate
Yes.
or repaint, and because this house stayed in the Drayton family for 7 consecutive generations, a lot of those changes just didn't happen. And the National Trust recognized how unusual and how special that was. And they said, we're going to do something different with this house museum. We're not going to restore it and fill it with objects and try to take ourselves back to what it was like in the 18th century. They said it's an artifact, and we are going to treat it like an artifact. And that is a very rare way to treat a historic house museum.
Mm.
On its face, I think it seems like it must be very simple and straightforward. You just don't mess it up, essentially, don't do anything.
Hmm.
But the reality is that it is very challenging to hold the line for a house this old, especially because it's open to the elements. There's no plumbing, there's no electricity, there's no heat or air conditioning. And this environment can be very punishing on a building.
Right.
And you add tens of thousands of visitors each year. This house wasn't made for that kind of foot traffic.
Hmm.
And so it is a challenge, but an incredibly rewarding one, to try to just keep the thing as it was.
Hmm.
Um, and so we have a real opportunity here to be leaders in our field. We get to treat the house as a laboratory for historic preservation. We're faced with a pressing issue. We gather the smartest people we can find in the field and bring them here and ask them to help us think through what's the very best thing that we can do. And then we share that with all of our colleagues so that they can learn from our challenges. And it's such a privilege, and it's also just a lot of fun.
It sounds like a lot of fun. And to think that you are in spaces that very few people, I'm sure you get to be on the roof and in the attic and places that even us, the visitors can't go to. And you think, oh, I'm one of only the few people who've ever been up here. How exciting that must be. And speaking of exciting projects, I know I kind of prepped you guys with this question before our interview, but I guess I'll start with Luke again. What have been the kind of top three? There's so many things y'all both are working on, but what would you say are the top three most exciting projects you've worked on so far at Drayton Hall?
Well, I've only been here for a short time, and all of the projects to me have been very exciting. But I have to
Mm.
say, one of the first experiences that I had was, during a mitigation-driven project. And mitigation-driven projects mean we're doing something to ensure the safety and the stability of the house. So
Mhm.
archaeology and preservation, our two departments work very closely together on a lot of these things. And we were doing a project to strengthen um, the mahogany staircase on the east
Right.
side of, and there was a load-bearing mortise and tenon joint that was in the basement under the set of servant stairs that would have allowed access to that first floor. And I was asked to go in there and make sure that we could clear the area so that a poured concrete slab could be put down to keep that jack in place. And
Mhm.
I was thinking to myself, there's not going to be anything in the basement of this house. I'm going to be down here for 2 minutes and then I'm going to be done.
Right.
And I was down there for close to 4 months because what we ended up discovering
Oh my
was
gosh.
a, a storage pit that would have been underneath the servant stair that would have probably been dug there purposefully to be able to keep things cool. We don't have any evidence of an ice house or a spring house or a dairy in the building inventory. So to be able to keep wine and other things at an
Mm.
ambient temperature, a storage pit is the easiest place to do that.
Wow.
We located one, lo and behold, right under where they wanted to put this Ellis jack, and in doing so, we also discovered that the original flooring that John Drayton put down when the house was constructed was terracotta tile, and then the bluestone tile that you walk on was put down
Mhm.
by Charles Drayton later. And that storage pit was a really nice time capsule because all of the artifacts deposited in there could have gone into the ground, you know, no earlier than 1820, and we know that because we found a diagnostic piece of pottery that was
Mm.
mortared to the bottom of one of the papers. You don't often get that lucky. So we know the kind of work that Charles Drayton was doing when he ends up becoming the master of Drayton Hall. So it's probably early 19th century that that's taking place, not as late as 1820 when that floor goes down. But these are all artifacts that are going to speak to John Drayton's period of occupation during the Revolutionary War. And we found everything from children's toys to colonel the pottery that the enslaved population would have made, used, cooked
Mhm.
with. Um, Evidence of the places of workspace, tiny straight pins, pieces of lead shot. Um, there were some military-related artifacts in there in the form of apothecary scales,
Wow.
and probably about 17 wine bottles. So lots of fun and
Wow.
Drayton Hall. So,
So a
yeah.
task you thought was going to take 5 minutes became a 4-year
Uh,
excavation.
Yeah, if I've learned anything, it's that you have to keep a really fluid timeline when you're quoting how long you're going to be in the field for archaeology because you never do know.
That's amazing. And what about you, Trish? Have there been certain kind of eureka moments or really moments that really stand out to you in your time at Drayton Hall?
Oh, yes. It's kind of hard to pick three, but I think I can do it.
Okay.
In 2018, we opened a new visitor center at Drayton Hall. And that was such an exciting time for us because for the first time ever, we had a gallery where we could exhibit objects from Drayton Hall. Since you've been here, you know that when you go on the house tour, there's nothing in the house. There's no
Nothing.
furniture or anything in there. And so for years, we had to tell people, we have really neat stuff, we promise. We just didn't have anywhere to show
Right.
it. So we were so excited to finally have an exhibit space where you can come see archaeological artifacts and furniture and, things that were used not only by the Drayton family, but by enslaved people. And we have
Yes.
tools that were used to build Drayton Hall on display in the gallery.
Amazing.
So that was such an exciting time. So I think I'm going to call that number one. We also did a really exciting project on Drayton Hall's portico. So, it's a fancy way to talk about the porch on the front of Drayton Hall. It's a very important feature.
Oh no, the stupid thing blurs
Doesn't
it
want to
out,
show
but
up. Yeah, there it is.
yeah.
So triangular pediment and all the columns, that's our portico. We work very closely with a structural engineer who helps us make sure that the house, structurally is sound and safe for everybody to come visit. And I think I can tell you that he used the phrase sudden catastrophic failure in his report.
What?
Yeah,
Oh
yeah.
no.
It really brings you up short when you hear that. So we closed it down immediately. We did keep the house open for tours, but for a few years you were not able to go on the portico.
Mhm.
Um, And during that time, we essentially did archaeology in the walls of the house. You can kind of carefully take out bricks and understand
Hmm.
the different issues that plagued the portico and how they tried to remedy them over time. And so that was just such an interesting time to be able to uncover these things that no one had seen since the 18th century, and to
Hmm.
kind of see their frustrations and see them trying to work through problems with the house, and then to get to take a crack at those problems ourselves.
Mm.
I think we all just kept thinking about what a privilege it was to leave our own mark on Drayton Hall. We also found two rooms under the stairs that we never knew about.
Wow.
If you would like to see what we saw, we have a clip on YouTube
Okay.
where you're looking underneath the front stairs, underneath the portico, and you'll
Yes.
see a beautiful kind of vaulted brick space. I'm
Mm.
calling them rooms, which is not really proper. It's actually just, it's a nice vault to hold up the stairs. Like structurally, it makes sense. But we saw beautiful decorative brickwork and really nice architectural details
Wow.
just hidden under the staircase, totally encased in brick.
My
Which is
goodness.
a mystery. Why do that in a place no one's ever going to see? So right now we think it's just an old change order. Maybe they meant for that to be exposed and then they changed their minds. And so it's just been
Interesting.
hidden under the stairs all these years.
Wow.
So that was a lot of fun. And then the project that Luke was talking about, where they were excavating in the cellar so that we could put in a jack, that was part of a project with our mahogany staircase that's original to the house that was constructed in the 1740s.
Mhm.
We disassembled the entire staircase like a giant 3D puzzle,
Mm.
and we lifted up a stair tread and found a doodle that somebody did in chalk in
What?
probably 1740s. I mean, that's just so exciting to see something like that.
Oh my
Um,
goodness. What was the
Artifacts
doodle
fell
of?
out.
Was
It
it an
was
animal?
there's a nice carving in the stair hall, and it looked like they were kind of mapping out, drawing what that carving was going to look like.
Oh my goodness.
So they did it in chalk, and so that survives on that stair tread. It's just been protected in there all this time.
Wow.
And a lot of fun things fell out, like a whole scythe blade, like big giant blade, like, the Grim Reaper carries, was
Yeah, for
just
cutting
in the
grass,
wall.
right?
Yeah, yeah, that was just in the wall of Drayton Hall.
Oh my gosh, that's
um,
crazy.
yeah, yeah. So the house just keeps giving us just wildly interesting things all the time.
Oh my goodness. And to your point about just the house kind of speaking to us and giving us, more clues and more history on a daily basis. When we took the tour, I want to say that one of the most poignant moments was the portion of the house where you can see the exposed brick, and the tour guide showed us the brick that seemingly has a thumbprint in it, and that's sort of been a thumbprint of an enslaved worker, most likely a child who was making bricks. And you just stand there and you think, oh my gosh. This living history in the moment was absolutely fascinating to see. And I'm so grateful that we could witness that, because obviously the work of enslaved people, you're not going to see artwork left behind. You're not going to see these, you know, but you're going to see pottery, you're going to see bricks, you're going to see these sorts of things. And it was just very touching to see that. All right, I think it's time now for a reader question or two, if y'all are okay with that. Um, okay, so from Doug from Columbia, he has two questions. The first question from Doug is, are the archives available for public research at Drayton Hall?
Yes, they are. A lot of our archival materials are available online through the Low Country Digital Library.
Okay.
So you can read documents that have been scanned. You can try your hand at paleography. Charles Drayton had fairly decent handwriting. You can read it if you want. And if you don't want, it's also transcribed. Many of them are transcribed. So anyone who's interested can go look at those things right now. A lot of the collection is there, but not all of it.
Mm-hmm.
So people are welcome to visit special collections at the Addlestone Library at the College of Charleston.
Okay.
The Drayton papers are there. sometimes it helps to reach out to one of us first and say who you are and what you're interested in researching, because some of the documents we have special restrictions on. So
Sure.
you just want to make sure if there's something in particular you'd like to see, it helps to just reach out first so that we can facilitate that visit and make sure you can see what you'd like to see or not. Um, so that's available. We also have a preservation archive that we
Mhm.
maintain with all the records about our modern day efforts to preserve the house, to do archaeology, to care for the landscape. And I've never said no to a request for information from that archive. So if anyone is looking for things related specifically to preservation, it's not accessible online, but you can always send an email and I'm happy to send along PDFs.
Fantastic. Thank you. Luke, do you have anything to add to what Trish said?
No, it's just that, don't be afraid of either of us. We're happy to share. Same goes for the archaeological collection. We are getting ready to launch some of the findings from a significant feature called the South Flanker Well,
Mhm.
to go live on a website that Monticello maintains called the Digital Archive of Atlantic Comparative Slavery. So the public will be able to see photos of some of the artifacts that have been recovered and compare them against other sites. So we're working on a lot of different things that we can do to get the material out there if you're not physically able to visit Drayton Hall, and then use as a
Absolutely.
resource.
Fantastic.
Should
Thank you.
also add, if someone is interested in doing genealogical research, specifically about people who were enslaved here,
Mm.
we have more and more information about that and are really trying to share that as much as possible. So we have an account on ancestry.com where
Oh,
people can
wow.
go and see what we have found about people who were enslaved here and their descendants. We also have a colleague here, Amber Satterthwaite, who gets emails from people all the time looking for
Mm.
information about their ancestors, and she's happy to help people make connections.
That is fantastic to hear. And have you found that there are descendants of the people who were enslaved at the property who are coming to visit or having special I've noticed recently in my research, certain families have had reunions at plantations. Is that something that y'all have seen, or will it happen in the future?
We are hoping to have a reunion next year.
Oh my,
We just talked about it in a meeting yesterday, so that's something that we're working on. And we have had descendants come to Drayton Hall. And if we know that someone's coming ahead of time, we like to try to make sure that those people have a special experience, that we can pull whatever documents we have about their ancestors. Some people come to see our historic caretaker's house.
hmm.
That's a building that was constructed around 1870, we think for a white caretaker, but then a family, a Black family that was previously enslaved at Drayton Hall, they moved in and had a presence here until 1960.
Oh
Um,
wow.
and so we've had several visits from that family, and
Hmm.
we're happy to facilitate kind of more of a private visit for people just to go into that space
Hmm.
and, not have to be on a public tour or anything like that. Just, so you can go experience it privately. And again, people
Absolutely.
are welcome to call or email if that's something that they'd like to do.
That's fantastic. Thank you for that. Um, and kind of going back to, let's actually continue with our reader questions because we've got some more really good ones here. This is from Catherine from Clinton, New York. And this kind of goes hand in hand with what we were just talking about as well. She's curious to hear about the evolving conversation about how to represent the multiple points of view of the many tiers of plantation dwellers and experiences, especially when it comes to the experiences of the enslaved workers who lived and worked at Drayton Hall. How do those stories get represented in tours, in the site's literature, and even in the gift shop, etc.? So I know we've kind of touched on this from a couple different angles, but maybe Luke, would you like to speak on that for a second?
Yeah, sure, of course. And I want to go back to a comment Trish made about our colleague who directs the education department here at Drayton Hall, Amber Satterthwaite, who spent a lot of time
Mm.
with Charles Drayton's journal to tease out the individual names of the enslaved population, which is a challenging task in the 18th and 19th century because so many have the same names. So, she almost worked as if it was an event-based, research database. So you could tease out the different people who were named Caesar, the different people named Mary,
Wow.
the different people named Doll. And
Mm.
when you have a look at the work that she compiled of all the enslaved members' names that we've got, it's a staggering list for a very short period of occupation, because this is only Charles Drayton's occupation. It's not John's, because we
Mm-hmm.
have a very imperfect record of what that might have looked like. But from my standpoint, working with the archaeological record and being able to marry that up with the documentary record, I'm hopeful that we're going to be able to hit on artifacts that we can, kind of pinpoint to being anchored in certain spaces and time, and perhaps be having been used by some of these individuals.
Mm-hmm.
One thing that is important to point out is that you have multiple layers of a plantation landscape here. So while our main focus is on the Drayton family and their occupation, there's also that really important component of pre-Drayton European occupation on the
Absolutely.
landscape too. So being able to tease that out and figure out exactly what we're working with on the plantation landscape, I think, is where archaeology has a very serious role to play in getting to that. So I think that, and Trish can speak to this a little bit more than I can as the newcomer. I frequently say it's my first day at Drayton Hall because there is so much to learn and unpack from the time period of when we've been, open to the public in 1974. But the tours have changed, I think, markedly from the first time I visited Drayton Hall as a young child in 1989 to now, where there is more of an emphasis on getting the story of the enslaved into the main house tour, and also on the landscape and grounds as well. Where previously it had really been a major focus on the Drayton family, their material world, and the architecture. So I think that we're getting it more of a nuanced approach where we can talk about everybody who lived on the property in tandem and not just privilege one data set over another.
Yes. By the way, Luke, how long have you worked at Drayton Hall?
I think I'm coming up on my 3rd-year anniversary. So
Oh,
it's
I thought you were going to say you've been there for a year or something.
no,
That's
no,
something
it's
to snip at.
like I said, it feels like it. You're drinking from a fire hose, and so I've learned an awful lot about rice, indigo, coming from a tobacco and wheat landscape. So never
Well,
stop learning.
in my research for the newsletter, of course, I went down the rabbit hole of Carolina gold rice,
Mhm.
and of course had to get my hands on some because I just heard how incredible it was to eat, and I did eat it, and it was out of this world. And so that just kind of brought me back in time, and that's a whole other conversation. But it is so interesting that the property, it started as rice, correct? Rice cultivation, and then a little bit of indigo, like you said, and then it was phosphate mining, correct? After that,
There was a little bit of cotton that
oh right, the
Charles tried
cotton.
to cultivate, but I think most of the big kind of cash-producing plantations that the Draytons owned are not necessarily Drayton Hall, but it still is a productive place. I think one of the many myths to bust is that this was just a showpiece.
Mm,
Yes, of course, the house is impressive, but it still has a purpose. There's still acreage that's under cultivation here.
right,
Uh,
right.
and then, of course, yeah, you do get into the phosphate period of mining and the phosphate period of preserving the landscape. Because if clauses hadn't been put in place, it's likely the whole plantation would have been strip mined and then the house torn down for architectural salvage. So,
How lucky are we that that was not the case? Wow. And then
Can
Trish,
we
I'd love,
circle back to your reader question about the
yes,
gift
I was
shop?
gonna say about the
yeah, I
what?
didn't
Sorry.
touch on that, so that's a
Yeah, I loved that part of that question. I don't think anyone has asked that before, and I thought that was such a good question to ask. So we have a wonderful director of retail here who reaches out to each one of us to ask for help and inspiration about what kinds of things we think should be in the shop. So the books that you see available for purchase are things that, all of the curatorial staff here are reading or really enjoy or think help kind of illuminate more of what we're trying to interpret here. There are food items like, the Carolina gold rice, so you can really experience the flavors of this part of the world. There are cookbooks also from people who are really helping us understand foodways in Charleston. And I think one of the most enlightening, like incredible aha moments that I've had here is when Chef Kevin Mitchell, who has really devoted himself to understanding enslaved cooks, he came and prepared food for us, inspired by what he saw in the diaries of, what Toby and Mary and Dumplin, all these enslaved cooks, what were they cooking for the Draytons? And people often are probably thinking about okra and fried chicken and things like that. But what we learned is they were making French cuisine.
I was going to ask if it was French.
It was, and they're making it, over an open fire. And so Chef Kevin made this most beautiful, like chilled pea soup with lump crab meat in it that I'm still thinking about.
Oh my goodness.
It was delicious and just totally changed how I thought about what kind of food was coming out of this place. And so we've tried to reflect that in the shop as well. So I hope people find it to be kind of a multi-sensory experience, because that's what we're going for.
It definitely was. And there were also sweetgrass baskets for sale, I noticed as well. And that was something when my husband and I went down to Charleston, we actively sought out the merchants, both in the Charleston market and also on the Sweetgrass Highway as well. Unfortunately, it was a Sunday and I think everyone was at church, so no one was out on the Sweetgrass Basket Highway, but I love that as well. And I do think your gift shop is wonderfully has a wonderful diversity of offerings. So, and in general, I want my audience to know that the whole visitor center it seems like it's still brand new. It's beautifully done. The architecture is beautiful. The museum part of it, the kind of introductory video, the gift shop, it really is a beautiful experience. So even before you get to the tour and the Drayton Hall itself, you have this wonderful kind of entree into the experience. So I want everyone to know that. Okay. Oh, and Trish, do you have any other thoughts, kind of piggybacking off what Luke said about, um, your experience with how the site is portraying the many different types of people that lived and worked there, or anything else to add to that piece as well?
Yeah, I would like to just echo what Luke said about the work that our colleague Amber Satterthwaite is doing. There's so much to learn. We know we can always be improving on, telling more stories about more people here. And so Amber went to a great workshop offered by the Smithsonian on ethical interpretation. And she's really been making an effort to learn how we can do more and do better. So you'll see that our tours of the main house now start in the cellar, because
Yes,
we want to center the enslaved people who were really generating the wealth that made all of this possible. You'll see that in the gallery as well. We have beautiful furniture and Chinese export porcelains, but we're also interpreting slavery at Drayton Hall and trying to make sure that we always keep in mind that all the wealth that made this possible was coming from enslaved labor. And so that's something that we've really leaned into more and more. And we're always looking for opportunities to do more of that.
Yeah. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe I even saw in the museum area that there was the Drayton family brand that they used on the enslaved people that worked for them. And I just stopped and I looked and I said, I can't believe I'm seeing this right now. I mean, wow, that was very, I don't know what the right word, harrowing, but important to see. And actually, how many, Luke, going back to what you were saying about your the director of education, how she's working on the list of the number of enslaved people that worked in Charles's time. How many enslaved people are we talking about at kind of the height of Drayton Hall?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think one of the challenges becomes that when you get into Charles Drayton's journal and the work that Amber has teased out, is that what we're seeing are that members of the enslaved population were spread out across the vast plantation empire. So one place that Charles Drayton references frequently in his journal is an island called Jahasi, which is down in the Ace Basin on the
Hmm.
Edisto River, and it's a big rice production site. But it seems like most of his skilled laborers are coming from Jahasi up to Drayton Hall and
Hmm.
moving back and forth. So
Oh.
I would say that there is a certain degree of difficulty in trying to tie, how many individuals might have just been on this plantation landscape.
Hmm.
And Trish might have a better idea of the number than I, but it's definitely trending towards 500, I believe,
Okay.
and that's just from Charles's journal. So I
Right.
want to
Be-
continuously emphasize that there are way more people, I'm sure, that are going to be
And
able to be brought out of that narrative. So,
and to your point, I mean, that was Charles, but I like there was a larger Drayton family that had other plantations, correct, and more enslaved people as well. It was almost like a Drayton family, not empire, but how would you describe that?
I, I think that's appropriate.
An
And
empire.
again, Charles had multiple plantations.
Hmm.
John had multiple plantations. Other members of the family had plantations, and then
Right.
they all marry into other plantation empires, so to speak. The
So maybe
Middletons,
empire
for
is a good
example,
word to use.
yeah,
Hmm.
are heavily tied to this. So yeah, it's
Visitors who come to our gallery will see a large map on the wall behind that brand that you mentioned. And that map is our attempt to help wrap our brains around how many people we might be talking about, because we
Hmm.
don't know a number, but we do know that John Drayton owned upwards of 76,000 acres. And it's hard to fathom how much land is that. So we've created this map where we've highlighted just in South Carolina alone how much land they owned, so that that might help us think about how many people it would take to make that productive and profitable.
Wow, that's incredible to think of the vastness of that number of 76,000 and then to work backwards and think about the labor needed to make that all run. It's mind-boggling. All right, next question from Randall in Greenville. If you could recreate an experience in its original form, any part of Drayton Hall, physical or temporal, what would you recreate? And I interpret this as could you recreate a building or maybe even an experience? How about Trish, we start with you on this one?
Ooh, okay, I'm gonna climb up onto my soapbox. Uh, I
Okay.
just want to see what the backside of Drayton Hall looked like in the 18th century. We have
Okay.
paintings and sketches and photographs of the front, always the front. I have 1,000 questions
What
about
about
what
the
it looked like
back?
if you just go around to the other side. So now when I am being a tourist and going somewhere, I'm making a point to go photograph the back of everything.
The back of the
uh,
thing. I
so
love
that
it.
in the future someone else can just see what it looked like. So I'll climb down off of my soapbox because that's it. I just want to see what the back of the place looked like.
Okay. Well, actually, while we're on that, I'm going to bring up my little guy again. My favorite. Oh, this is so annoying. This,
we got it.
Yeah.
can you tell the incredible story of how Drayton Hall received this watercolor? And I will try to put in this video a picture of what Drayton Hall looks like today, but visitors will notice that the colonnades are no longer there and that this was a surprise. Can one of you talk about this incredible story?
Do you want to do it or you want me to?
I'll punt to you. You were here while this was taking place. I was
I can't
watching it
even
from
imagine what it
Yeah.
was like
virtual land.
to
So,
receive
Yeah.
this in the mail.
Uh, so what you just held up is a 1765 watercolor of Drayton Hall that we had not seen at all before 2008. It belongs to a man who lives in Virginia. It is still just in his private collection. And he reached out to Drayton Hall and said, I have a watercolor of Drayton Hall in 1765. And I'm told that the person who answered the phone was rude and said, sure you do, um,
Oh,
and hung
oh
up.
my good.
So
Oh my
um,
gosh.
thank goodness
Mhm.
he did not give up. He photocopied the
Mhm.
watercolor and sent it to Drayton Hall with no return address. Um, and in looking at it, we were able to see pretty quickly there are several details in this watercolor that you wouldn't know about if you were just coming to Drayton Hall today. So the person depicted a lightning rod on a part of the house that we know archaeologically that's where it was. And
Oh my
um,
gosh, I see it. I see it right
yeah,
there.
yeah, that was a very important detail to tell us this thing is legit. We also didn't know about the colonnade when this thing arrived in the mail. We knew that there had been a low fence there at one point, but this full colonnade with these great columns connecting the flankers, we didn't know that that existed. Um, so if you think about when you get a letter in the mail, at the post office, they put that stamp on it that has the, postal code from where the thing came from. So our current CEO, Carter Hudgens, and our former executive director, George McDaniel, got in the car and went to Virginia to this postal code. And it had the last 4 digits, but they were told that that is not information people share. Luke, confirm or deny if that.
I can confirm that as a former
Okay.
postal service employee. So
Okay. Yes, they will not tell you what the last 4 means. So they put an ad in the local newspaper and started knocking on doors and said, "We're looking for the person who owns this watercolor." They knocked on the right door. A woman knew that it belonged to her neighbor. Um, and
What a
so
story.
yeah, so they finally met the man, and I'm sure they apologized profusely and asked if we could please be friends. And he's been very kind and loaned the watercolor to us for exhibit. And so, yeah, it's huge. We've learned so much from this watercolor.
Wow. And has he been back to Drayton Hall himself?
He must have. I don't think I've met him though.
And do we know how he got hold of this watercolor?
I believe that he owns a whole collection by the same artist and that it has
Oh,
descended in his family.
got it. That's such a phenomenal story. And Trish, what was it like to be at Drayton Hall when this was first revealed to this, like confirmed and revealed to the staff? What was that like?
This was a funny time for me. So this was when I was still in grad school and just kind of hanging around and trying to convince everybody to hire me.
Hanging
So
around.
I didn't get the full experience. I'd say that, everyone else who was here officially had. But as someone who was studying the architecture of Drayton Hall and trying to understand the significance of the style of it, this was such a cool time to be learning more about this place and to have this new watercolor to look at because the details are just
Hmm.
amazing. I mean, it
They really
shows
are.
us things on the house that don't survive, that weren't depicted by other artists. So as a research tool, I was thrilled to have this. And I still look at it all the time. I pull it up on my computer and zoom in and see what else I can discover.
Oh my gosh. I love that story so much. It's so fascinating. And really quickly, what did ever happen to the colonnade? It just kind of fell apart over time. How did that disappear?
well, that could be a question that archaeology can answer, and that's one that we're hoping to turn our attention to in the fall because we're not through with the North Flanker building just yet.
Hmm.
So we would like to expand out a little bit more into what I would consider to be kind of the forecourt of the west facade of the house, and see if we can find more of a footprint to that. So there's an informal bet that floats around based on what that evidence will reveal. So jury is
Got
still
it.
out.
Jury's still out. And I know you said that more than likely the flanker buildings were spaces used by the enslaved, people working on the plantation. And I guess you'll keep finding this out, but were the colonnades just basically like, would people be running to and from the flanker house to the kitchen? Do we know that yet, or is it still sort of, still trying to figure that out?
Well, we have a little bit of evidence on the north flanker building that there
Mm.
was an entry point to that structure on the east side. So that would have been behind the colonnade. And based on
Okay.
the location of the colonnade, there is a door to access the main house from there. So
Mm.
I don't think there would have been people going through the colonnade, so to speak, but more behind. So it's a way to screen off the enslaved workers who would have
Ah,
been moving back and
wow.
forth between those two flanker buildings.
Got it. Got it.
This is part of the bet, and it hinges on what team archaeology finds.
I
So,
see.
yeah, I
And then,
really like to get people to take sides on this one.
so, and then these flanker buildings, were they kind of additional kitchens? Were they just kind of servants' quarters? I mean, do we yet know kind of what exactly they were used for? I mean, there's so much that I know y'all are excavating, and that pottery is just incredible. Or were they additional storage spaces? Can you kind of talk a little bit about the flanker buildings?
I think almost all of the above, not to be too wishy-washy, but
Oh, no, it's
you know,
fine.
a lot is going to come out when we do catalog the artifacts and analyze them. The South Flanker building was completely excavated between 1975 and 1976, and it was thought that that was, you know, kind of an ancillary kitchen to what you see in the main house with that big hearth and everything. And I could see
Yes.
that being a function. The
Yes.
other interesting thing too is there's evidence for a crawl space in the north flanker. The south flanker doesn't have one. Um,
Oh.
so what does that mean? We're still not entirely sure about that, but I can tell you from the excavations that we've conducted, you know, this past field season, the number of straight pins, buttons, thimbles,
What?
scissors, things that relate to personal adornment and sewing are coming out of there. So, you know, that
Wow.
could speak to the space being, you know, a laundry or a wash house or just a larger
Hmm,
workspace for somebody who's doing tailoring or working
I
on
see.
clothing. But yeah, multi-use is, I think, the best way to describe those structures.
Absolutely. Absolutely. All right. And then Luke, if you could recreate an experience from Randall and Greenville, if you could recreate an experience in its original form, any part of Drayton Hall, physical or temporal, or an experience there, what would you like to recreate? What would you recreate?
Well, I'm glad that Trish didn't put her soapbox away just yet,
Oh,
because one of my big questions and areas for archaeological inquiry is the east side of the house and the designed landscape. When you walk around back there, you can see physical evidence of an awful lot of earth moving that took place to create a designed landscape. There's the Ha Ha ditch. There's evidence for you know, terracing, the raised alley. We have, you know, documentary evidence from John Drayton's period of occupation, mostly from people who were passing through during the Revolutionary War, of serpentine pathways, fountains, a zoological park, something called an octagon. And then we also have the evidence archaeologically of the garden house, which would have sat on the other side of the designed landscape with windows that would have faced towards the house, not the river. So the design landscape is one of those things that's fascinated me. I don't think that
yes.
any plantation in the American South has really been able to recreate an
Hmm.
18th or 19th century landscape um, accurately, just because garden archaeology is difficult. And more
Right.
often than not, you have multiple layers of it. But because Drayton Hall really has its heyday, you know, between 1738 and roughly 1844, 1845, I think we have a really good shot at being able to deploy different methods to try to see what that might have looked like and employ some different techniques to see what might have been planted out there as well.
Absolutely. And when we took the tour and the wonderful audio tour we had was helping us visualize that for a visitor at Drayton Hall, not only are you approaching it from this extraordinary driveway, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I know that there was kind of that mound out front. I don't know if that was, pre 1840s, but there would have been, there's this incredible staircase, like the wealth on display when you go into the house, from the paint color to the flooring, the incredible intricacies of the ceiling work and the molding and the incredible staircase. And then you go out the back, and to your point, Luke, I mean, I was trying, my husband and I were trying to imagine this almost like a menagerie of, this almost royal proportions. I mean, correct me if I'm
Mhm.
wrong, but it seemed like the Draytons were trying to create almost um, a royal feel to their environment. Would you say that's true?
Yeah, it's they're mimicking, you know, English country houses and Italianate villas.
Yep.
So yeah, the you know, back of house, so to speak, is just as important, if not more so, to project that than the front.
Yes, absolutely. Love that. And then a question from Alan in Raleigh, North Carolina. What advice would you give to a young person interested in a career in historic preservation? Trish, let's start with you.
I would say that we get a lot of requests for people who are interested in internships or just want to get involved in historic preservation. And I always sit up and take notice when someone has a specific interest that they can tell me about. Hi, I'm interested in preservation and I really want to know more about this thing, or that that helps someone kind of rise to the top when you get 10 emails a month about someone who wants to come volunteer or intern or something. When someone knows what they're into, that helps me say, yeah, we've got that, you can come do that, or no, but I know someone else who can help you with that. So I think that helps a lot. And just like, if you get that opportunity, just like try, get engaged, like we've had several really amazing volunteers and interns over the years that I know we go out of our way to recommend them to people and, make phone calls. And
Sure.
really, it's just the people who are excited. They're just as excited as we are.
Mm-hmm.
Those are the people that I have followed them for years and years and always taken every opportunity to try to help them, get into the field or get into a cool job or something. And it's more rare than you'd think. So that would be my recommendation.
Thank you. And what about you, Luke?
Sure. Well, I also want to add that I feel like this is an accurate statement to make, Trish. So just jump up and say if I'm wrong. But I feel like both you and I are getting the ability to help train the next generation of historic preservation professionals from our work that we do at Drayton Hall, but then extracurriculars working with the College of Charleston, Clemson University, and other people who are getting advanced degrees in this work. But I would say be curious about what the field of historic preservation is. It's not just old houses and buildings. It's about landscapes. It's about archaeology. It's about conservation. It's about restoration. It's about the objects that were in these spaces. And then it's also about the wider landscape and even that abstract concept of viewshed and preserving open spaces so that people can visualize what the space might have looked like, and that gets preserved for future generations. So I think that the really fun thing for me with historic preservation is, as a blanket term, there's a little bit of something for everybody. And I think in everybody's hometown, community, whatever, there's always going to be a place that matters. So figure out what it is about that place that matters for you and
Mm-hmm.
what interest it piques, and you can always go from there. And then there are all sorts of resources and professional networks that you can get involved with. So be
Absolutely.
curious, not to steal that from Ted Lasso, but he's appropriate on a lot of different levels. So
I love it. Ted Lasso reference. Amazing. All right. So we are going to wrap up our interview with a little rapid fire trivia for you both. I'll start with Trish. We're going to do some just South Carolina focused questions, just kind of a rapid fire. I want to hear some of your opinions about these things. Are you ready?
I'm ready.
Okay. Which historical figure from South Carolina history would you most like to have dinner with?
I was not ready for this one. I thought so hard about this and I couldn't pick. Um, okay, I'm gonna say Charlotta Drayton because I'm told she was a really cool lady. Like, for her time, she was different. She did her own thing. Like, she never married. She loved to read. She traveled the world. I think I would like to talk to her.
Yeah, love that. Favorite South Carolina food or dish?
Oysters.
Favorite South Carolina festival or event?
The first thing that came to mind is the okra strut, which happens, I think, in Irmo, South Carolina. I'm not sure I've ever been there, but I love okra. And I just love living in a place that loves okra enough to have a strut dedicated to it. I think that's hysterical.
I think it's hysterical too. Favorite
Yeah.
South Carolina history book or movie?
Gosh. Do you know what? In fourth grade, I read a book about Stede Bonnet, the gentleman pirate, and I was captivated. And I credit that with my interest in South Carolina history.
I love that. If you
Okay.
could go back to any time and to any period in South Carolina history, when would it be and why?
I think I would definitely just come to Drayton Hall in like 1750 and look around. for
Yeah,
sure.
I figured you'd
Yeah.
say that.
Yeah.
And then most surprising thing you've learned about South Carolina history along the way.
Mm, I don't know what's most surprising to me, but I think a thing that I hear a lot that surprises other people is that much of South Carolina was under the ocean at one point. I mean, I know that we had megalodon teeth on display for Shark Week. And
So
you know,
cool.
I grew up in the Midlands of South Carolina, and that the sandhills run through there, and because that was beachfront property, and we talk to people about that a lot, and people are always surprised by that.
I read in my research, I wrote a section of the newsletter about enslaved people discovering megalodon teeth on plantation properties in South Carolina, and they accurate, you know, the slave owners, the plantation owners didn't know what it was, but because the enslaved people were from, you know, from Africa, they had seen elephant teeth before, and they were very adamantly saying that this is from an elephant type creature, and nobody believed them. And then this happened also in I think I found in Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson had something similar happen to him as well. And so I just think that's, oh, I wish I could have seen the megalodon tooth on display at Drayton Hall, but I just loved that story when I found it. I was like, wow, this could be a movie. This could be a TV episode. I mean, so interesting. Okay, more rapid fire.
Okay.
Last question. Besides Drayton Hall, what is a must-visit place in South Carolina for history buffs?
Oh, all right. I struggled with this one too, but my favorite, like when I'm being a tourist, my favorite place to go in Charleston is the Old Exchange and Provost Dungeon because you can go downstairs and it is very creepy and cool. And I can't think of another place in Charleston where I feel more like I've been transported back in time
Mm,
than when I am in that building. You can see part of the old like wall that surrounded Charleston. Like it's just really cool down there.
absolutely. All right, Luke, it's your turn. Are you ready?
All right, I'm ready.
Rapid
Fired
fire.
up.
Okay. Which historical figure from South Carolina history would you most like to have dinner with?
David Drake. And
Tell us
for
who he is.
those folks who don't know who David Drake is, he's been getting an awful lot of press over the past 20 years for being one of the
Okay.
enslaved potters in the old Edgefield district, making stoneware jugs.
Yes.
And he would often inscribe things on the stoneware jugs, either a dig against his enslaver, Lewis Miles, or just what the contents of the jug held, or religious inscriptions. And he also has the distinction of making face jugs. And there are conferences around what David Drake was doing, how he learned how to read and write, all of this supposition. And I would love to hear from the man himself.
Absolutely.
That's a
Now
good
he's
one.
also now he's known as Dave the Potter now, right?
David the Potter, yep. So
Yeah, now his work is being shown in the Smithsonian
yeah, and the
as
Charleston Museum has a collection, so you can see those on display. And there's a traveling show right now that's at the High Museum of Art in Atlanta that
oh,
showcases his work.
so fantastic. And all the little sayings he put on the pieces of pottery, it's just an incredible thing. I love that. Okay, favorite South Carolina food or dish?
Okay, now I don't know if this is ubiquitous to South Carolina. I think it might be across the American South, but I've encountered it more since moving here. It's called chow chow, which is a type of basically it's a pickle relish, and it can be sweet or it can be hot, and it's usually okra, tomato, peppers. There's all sorts of different things that go into it. But I first encountered it on hot dogs at a local stand over in Mount Pleasant. And I've since tried different examples across South Carolina, and I know that it's not all the same, but I'm hooked. It's great. Try it.
Okay. Do you think that's a Gullah inspired dish or just something that evolved?
There are a couple of food historians who I think get together and argue about this frequently. Some people say that it came from Chinese railroad workers in Alabama,
Oh,
and
okay.
other folks in South Carolina do pinpoint it to a Gullah Geechee tradition. But
Okay.
I think that there are a lot of different cultures that have the tradition of pickling vegetables. So
Very
who
cool.
knows? But it's
Who
good.
knows? It sounds delicious. All right, favorite South Carolina festival or event?
I'm going to go with an event on this one, and
Okay.
I've not done it just yet. But next year, I'm planning on running the Gator Gauntlet, which is a 5K race at Huntington Beach State Park, which is up near Myrtle Beach. And it's in
Nice.
an area with a relict rice landscape. And I can tell you, I have never seen as many alligators as I have there. But I
Oh
want
my
the
God.
t-shirt.
You
So.
want the t-shirt. I love it. Favorite South Carolina history book or movie?
This isn't an out and out South Carolina history book, but it's a book called The Cacique of Kiowa, which was written by an author named William Gilmore Simms, who I'm sure very few people have heard of, but he was writing in the 1840s. He's a contemporary of James Fenimore Cooper and some of those
Okay.
other American authors. But
Wow.
he was basing his early history of South Carolina and the 17th century settlement on actual events to weave together a novel. And it is fantastic for the imagery of what the Low Country looked like and the interactions of natives and newcomers.
Wow, that's amazing. All
Writing.
right, if you could, yeah, I know. I'm mentally writing this down too. So did he actually see the landscape, or how did he weave
He
together
was a
those?
lifelong Charlestonian. So what he did was he had the history from his family of, being some of the first members of the Lords Proprietor groups in the
Right.
1670s. But then he's also drawing on other narratives and diaries and journals to be able to create a great story. But the history holds up. It's an excellent read.
So exciting. I got to read that. All right. If you could go back to any time period in South Carolina history, or we'll just say in Drayton Hall history, when would it be and why?
Now, I opted for South Carolina history with this,
Okay.
and as I'm trying to learn more about my newly adopted state, um,
Yes.
I would say that I would try to go back to the period of initial European contact on the coast, and that occurs down around where Beaufort is today at Santa Elena in 1526, when the Spanish were expanding the northern limits of what would be their empire in North America, and what that might have looked like and been like. I think would be absolutely fascinating.
Completely agree. And then what is the most surprising thing you've learned about South Carolina history along the way?
Railroads and how connected the state was by railroads. And we have the advent of the railroad industry beginning here in Charleston in 1835. And, just the miles of track and how innovative South Carolina was in expanding out the railroad network. And, I grew up in the industrial western portion of Pennsylvania. So trains have always had a fascination for me. But you drive through these small rural towns in South Carolina, and you can tell that there once was a line running
Yes.
through. And, the architecture and the landscape is all really
Yes.
interesting related to that.
So interesting. Love that. And besides Drayton Hall, what is a must-visit place in South Carolina for history buffs?
I would say for anybody who wants to experience thousands of years of human occupation on the landscape, take yourself down to Port Royal, which is just down around Beaufort, and with the islands that you see, the sea islands off of Beaufort or off of Port Royal rather, there are preserved shell rings that date back to 4,000 years, before Europeans showed up, that are perfectly preserved. You get the evidence of the Spanish and French incursions into the area. And to me, that landscape looks like what the Low Country used to be
Mm,
before more development kind of came in. And there's also great food down there too. So I
mm.
plan my field trips around eating destinations, and I think that always
The chow chow and the food
keeps people happy. Yeah, that's it.
and alligators and t-shirts.
Alligators, yep, of course. I'm still fascinated by them. So.
Oh my gosh. Well, I want to thank you all, you both so much for the honor of interviewing you today and for hearing your knowledge and hearing your stories. And I want to thank you for the incredible work that you do on a daily basis to preserve this gem, this architectural historic gem, for all of us in South Carolina and the United States and even the world, really. And my last question for you is, how can myself and our readers kind of support the important work that you're doing? We'd love to hear whether it's donations, visiting, what is the best way we can support your work?
I think, making donations is an obvious answer. You can do that online on our website, but I also love it when people just get involved with us on social media. We really like to share what's going on day to day on there. And it's so fun to see our friends across the country and even in other parts of the world commenting on the work that we're doing. And that helps spread the word about our work here. So that would be my vote. if you're not feeling inclined to make a donation, that's totally fine. But following us on social media would be really helpful.
Thank you. What about you, Luke?
I agree, and I would add to that. I mean, nothing can beat the experience of actually coming here and visiting, but that's not always possible for everybody. And we like to think that we have a wider reach that's national and international as well. And to add to what Trish was saying about our social media presence and support in that way, we do a webinar series as well. So I think we're doing those, what, about 4 times a year now? And those are kind of a pay-as-you-wish, type of program where we
Fantastic.
talk about different elements of the work that we're doing.
Great. I'll be sure to add those to the newsletter. I'll be in touch with you guys to get those dates. Absolutely. Well, Trish Smith and Luke Pecoraro, thank you so, so much for taking the time to chat with me, my readers, answer our questions. You've given us so much to think about. And once again, thank you so much from the bottom of my heart for the work you're doing to this, for this wonderful treasure of Drayton Hall in South Carolina. So with that, I'd like to thank you again, and we're going to sign off from our interview today. And I'll click pause on the recording, and we can talk right after this, but we'll end the recorded part of the interview now. Thank you both so much.
All right.
Thanks.
Thank you.